Over the past several decades, educators and entertainers and journalists and politicians created an army of psychologically engineered tantrum throwers to be the muscle behind their movements. But when these megalomaniacal sacks of rage emerged from their incubation safe spaces, they started turning on the people who made them. Who'da thunk it? It's only been the plotline of like 800 movies and books. Human beings create something that eventually rises up against them. We build powerful computers, but then the computers become self-aware and we suddenly find ourselves fighting against Terminators or trapped in the Matrix. We get some dinosaur DNA and decide to make dinosaurs, but oh no, the dinosaurs are eating us. We make super soldiers or monsters, but the super soldiers or monsters just don't respect our authority, and we end up in a struggle for our very existence. Well, it actually happened. These college professors and actors and reporters created a monster, and now that monster is eating them. But they decided to fight back with a letter in Harper's Magazine. So, their failsafe, their emergency shutdown plan is a letter. Let's go ahead and read the letter, and then we'll see why they're complete morons for thinking that this will help them. A letter on justice and open debate. Antifa loves justice, so this is sure to melt their hearts. Our cultural institutions are facing a moment of trial. Powerful protests for racial and social justice are leading to overdue demands for police reform, along with wider calls for greater equality and inclusion across our society, not least in higher education, journalism, philanthropy, and the arts. But this needed reckoning has also intensified a new set of moral attitudes and political commitments that tend to weaken our norms of open debate and toleration of differences in favor of ideological conformity. As we applaud the first development, we also raise our voices against the second. Uh-oh, they're raising their voices. The woke mob must be trembling in their balaclavas. I hope they don't drop their Molotov cocktails. The forces of illiberalism are gaining strength throughout the world and have a powerful ally in Donald Trump, who represents a real threat to democracy. But resistance must not be allowed to harden into its own brand of dogma or coercion, which right-wing demagogues are already exploiting. The democratic inclusion we want can be achieved only if we speak out against the intolerant climate that has set in on all sides. So far, so good. The woke mob doesn't like Donald Trump, so we'll tell them that riots and cancel culture are helping Donald Trump. That'll calm them down. The free exchange of information and ideas, the lifeblood of a liberal society, is daily becoming more constricted. While we have come to expect this on the radical right, censoriousness is also spreading more widely in our culture. An intolerance of opposing views, a vogue for public shaming and ostracism, and the tendency to dissolve complex policy issues in a blinding moral certainty. We uphold the value of robust and even caustic counterspeech from all quarters. But it is now all too common to hear calls for swift and severe retribution in response to perceived transgressions of speech and thought. More troubling still, institutional leaders, in a spirit of panicked damage control, are delivering hasty and disproportionate punishments instead of considered reforms. And here's where we find out that this entire letter is really about self-preservation. It's not that the authors and signers of the letter actually care about the free exchange of information, it's that they're also being canceled, and they don't like that very much. Editors are fired for running controversial pieces. Books are withdrawn for alleged inauthenticity. Journalists are barred from writing on certain topics. Professors are investigated for quoting works of literature in class. A researcher is fired for circulating a peer-reviewed academic study. And the heads of organizations are ousted for what are sometimes just clumsy mistakes. Poor victims of the monster they created. Whatever the arguments around each particular incident, the result has been to steadily narrow the boundaries of what can be said without the threat of reprisal. We are already paying the price, you sure are, In greater risk aversion among writers, artists, and journalists who fear for their livelihoods if they depart from the consensus or even lack sufficient zeal in agreement. These poor writers and artists and journalists, they spent years cheering on the mob, and now they're, quote, paying the price in greater risk aversion. An intolerable burden, to be sure. This stifling atmosphere will ultimately harm the most vital causes of our time. Yes, it will. The restriction of debate, whether by a repressive government or an intolerant society, invariably hurts those who lack power and makes everyone less capable of democratic participation. The way to defeat bad ideas is by exposure, argument, and persuasion, not by trying to silence or wish them away. We refuse any false choice between justice and freedom, which cannot exist without each other. As writers, we need a culture that leaves us room for experimentation, risk-taking, and even mistakes. We need to preserve the possibility of good faith disagreement without dire professional consequences. If we won't defend the very thing on which our work depends, we shouldn't expect the public or the state to defend it for us. And the letter was signed by a ton of writers and journalists and professors. Now, I'm sure that as we were reading that letter, you found yourself in complete agreement with much of it. The letter is absolutely correct, and yet it's one of the most idiotic letters ever written. Why? Because these educators and writers and entertainers are trying to reason with people who've been trained and conditioned not to reason. They created a monster that's incapable of rational thought, that's driven purely by rage, that doesn't feel pity or remorse, that's programmed only to destroy. And they're deluded enough to think that their magic bullet is a carefully worded letter. Sorry, Dr. Frankensteins, but your monster is coming for you. And it's just not a big fan of Harper's Magazine.